Good afternoon. My name is John Davis and I'm Chief Executive of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association UK, CPA UK. And this afternoon it's my pleasure to have with me Harriet Baldwin MP. Harriet, welcome.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And good to see you in good shape too. Thanks for your time this afternoon. Obviously in these challenging times with COVID, we're speaking to a range of parliamentarians about how they are finding how the UK Parliament is adapting. And I know we saw an interesting article from you in the week in the House magazine with a particular angle that was of interest to you. Perhaps you tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I raised the question of adjournment debates. These are the short debates that happen at the end of every parliamentary day, and there's space in this calendar for backbenchers like me to be able to raise issues and get a response from ministers. I did have one scheduled for last week, but because we're in this trial period in terms of hybrid proceedings, it got dropped from the calendar. And so I really wanted to make the point that these are really valuable ways of raising issues for constituents.
And at the moment, in the initial hybrid setup, there's no real equivalent space for that?
At the moment, in terms of the hybrid setup, we've managed to do departmental questions and we've managed to do statements. And that's as far as we've got. All those select committees like the Treasury Select Committee that I'm on, we are also sitting and have been sitting throughout recess. Today we're going to do a trial on voting, on the remote voting system for the first time. That's happening at 4 o'clock today, so we'll see how that goes. Right. And I've been asked by the whips to be on the Finance Bill Committee, and that will be interesting to see how we move forward in terms of legislation where there are some controversial areas. And normally we vote in committee and you have to be there kind of raising issues in the same physical space. So it'll be interesting to see how that really important piece of legislation makes progress now that it's passed its second reading this week.
Yes, that's 3 or 4 quite distinct parts of what constitutes, I suppose, parliamentary business. I suppose it shows the complexity of the challenge, doesn't it? But of the debates you have been involved in so far, I think you were speaking in one of the finance discussions, was it earlier this week? How has it actually been to be sort of involved in that? Were you involved remotely, or were you actually present in the chamber for that?
I've chosen to be in the chamber when I've had my name on the call list, but I know that the technology has also worked pretty well. It hasn't been absolutely flawless, but it's certainly, although not perfect, it's a lot better than us not being able to question ministers at this really important time.
And how was it in the chamber?
So the chamber's been completely adapted, and you'd hardly recognise it because we have to sit so far apart. So a room that is often absolutely rammed to the gills with standing room only now looks like a sort of deserted waiting room on a holiday, and it's very different. And we have had to suppress some of the rows so that we're all 2 meters apart.
Right, and so if you look back to your point about adjournment debates, can you see a way of delivering that with the current setup, with the technical setup?
Yeah, I think adjournment debates should be one of the easiest things to add in. They don't require a vote. They're normally extremely sparsely populated anyway, so there's usually just the minister on the front bench, the backbencher, the opposition spokesperson, and perhaps Jim Shannon, the member for Strangford, who's a very assiduous attender of all adjournment debates, and that's really pretty much it, usually along with the speaker and the clerk. So I think that should be something that's very straightforward to get going again, and I hope that the House authorities can get it going again as quickly as possible.
We'll watch that with interest, and perhaps if we do get to that point, and if, for example, your question on that issue or another issue is resurrected, perhaps we can come back to you on how it was. Voting, I suppose, is more critical and also more difficult. But so the trial this afternoon, can you tell us a bit more about that, if you're allowed to?
Well, I've been asked to register on Members Hub. I've been asked to be near my computer at 4 o'clock, and I've been asked to substitute a mobile phone number and an email address, an alternative email address. And I guess the idea is that they will give us an alert as to when a vote goes live on Members Hub. But, it'll be interesting to know, because you really have to know when they're likely to happen to be close enough to your computer to be checking. Whereas in the House, obviously, you know, a very loud bell goes. They're not going to really be able to do the very loud bell in people's homes. So I'm curious to know how many people will miss that notification.
Yes. And I suppose today is a little bit artificial in the sense that everyone is primed to wait for it. Whereas if we were in more routine business with a series of votes coming up, for example, that might not be the case.
Yeah, there is something called a deferred division that we do in normal proceedings, where we have a window of between 11:30 and 2 o'clock on a Wednesday to vote manually. And that is a long period. And I think that might work quite well. So making it work like deferred divisions. I think the thing that will be most difficult, and I mentioned the Finance Bill Committee, is when you're in a committee session and the vote suddenly comes at an unpredictable moment in time. And they'll have to think of ways to change procedure, I think, to make the timings of votes more predictable.
Yes. And that will need, I suppose, agreement, not just work by officials, but also agreement between parties to get to that point.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, you mentioned about committees as well. That obviously is something which we've seen quite a lot of progress already. Quite a lot of committees now, I think, have already, even 3 or 4 weeks into this crisis, met virtually. And that seems, we were speaking to one committee chair earlier this week, and that seems to be going quite smoothly.
Yeah, it's going quite well. There's pressure on broadcast slots, so they can't broadcast as much as they would do if they were in normal sitting. And so we've had to halve the number of meetings that we do each week. I think normally the Treasury Committee would meet twice, and at the moment we're having to meet just once. But I am very grateful to all of the witnesses who've been prepared to come in, and it's always rather intimidating to be interviewed by a select committee at the best of times, and to have to do that remotely is probably even worse.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. Do you think that's one of the innovations that would you be happy to see that sort of preserved into the future, of more use of remote participation in committees?
Yeah, I think it would be certainly something that would be good to be able to do, because you can then take evidence from people from wider afield, or people who perhaps aren't able to leave their homes. So I think that is a flexibility that would be good to leave in the system. We did have a session where we had 2 of our witnesses physically in the committee room and 1 attending by phone. This was before lockdown. And that really didn't work, because it didn't give that person who was attending by phone the chance to kind of butt in and say things when they wanted, and that telephone kept getting cut off. So I think there need to be, careful consideration given to how it and when it might work.
Yes, several of the members we've spoken to in the recent days have talked in various contexts that the immediacy, the sort of give and take, is something which is harder to replicate. Even with these quite sophisticated virtual systems.
Yeah, I mean, the cut and thrust of debate, you can imagine when normally someone introduces legislation, you can intervene on them, you can ask them the sort of crucial question, you can put them on the spot, and that doesn't happen at all under the new system. So I imagine that it just takes a bit more probing for backbenchers to really try and uncover what's going on and what's behind the points that ministers are making to us.
Absolutely. Harriet, you started with adjournment debates, which is obviously, while it's a process in the chamber, it's quite often focused on something of particular constituency interest, as you say. Obviously, for a lot of all members of the Commons, constituency work is always a key part of what you're doing and why you're there. How have you been finding trying to do your constituency work in these times?
Well, it's been extraordinary, actually, because there's been an incredibly high volume. As you can imagine, every aspect of life has been affected. Yeah. And so we've had very, very high volumes, which we've been handling. Myself and my constituency casework team, we're all working from home. Right. We're handling those volumes remotely, and we're replying to everything by email rather than what we normally rely on, which is the postal service. And I think where necessary, we're also telephoning constituents and having telephone surgeries rather than the face-to-face weekly surgeries that I normally hold. So by and large, the feedback from constituents, which is the important thing, has been very positive in terms of the service that we're able to give. And I do encourage anyone who's got an issue to contact their MP.
Good, and and I guess that's something which this crisis, there'll be your counterparts in parliaments across the Commonwealth and more broadly will be addressing very much these same issues. Obviously, everyone's parliament, everyone's context is different, but it's striking that we're in a crisis, which is, I think, one where there may be things to share from the UK experience, but I'm sure we'll have things to learn from other places too.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things that we've been doing is we can feed in points, because guidance has been changing very, very quickly. We can feed things into departments and get a very quick response from departments as well. So it's been almost like dealing with government on speed, and they've been very, very responsive and very reactive to points that have been raised from right across the House. I think I would highlight in particular that the Paymaster General, Penny Mordaunt, has been doing a daily phone call for all MPs, and she's been posting all the points raised on the intranet every day so that everyone can see that these issues are being addressed, and that's been a really helpful facility.
And perhaps one that certainly members would be very interested in keeping when we return to more normal times.
Yeah, who knows?
Right.
I think people will have very high expectation of how quickly government will react to things in the future, because they have reacted so quickly this time.
Yes, I mean, it's going to, I suppose what we're increasingly hearing is it's not going to be a sudden return to normal. Things will not suddenly overnight go back to normal. And I suppose the challenge for parliaments is to try to keep, and for governments and companies and others, is to keep what's good, to keep these things we've been forced into thinking about quickly, while we also don't lose some of the things we built up, systems and processes we built up over years. But
yeah, I mean, I think the Speaker and his team have done a fantastic job in finding ways for us to actually carry on scrutinising the executive in Parliament. And I love the way that you had this mixture of video conferencing along with the Sergeant at Arms with his sword and the mace and all of the traditional paraphernalia in Parliament. It just shows how adaptable Parliament really is.
Well, here. No, I think it's been very impressive, and we look forward to with you being part of that and watching that. But for now, thanks very much for your time and for sharing your experiences so far. And as I say, maybe we'll be able to come back and talk to you further, especially if we get some progress on that adjournment debate point that you raised at the beginning.
Absolutely, that's great. Thanks, John, so much for having me on.
Thanks, Harriet.